Est-ce que tu speak français or ASL? The biopsychology of language acquisition and bilingual status. So let's begin with some common knowledge. A lot of people know that being bilingual and acquiring a second language changes the chemistry of the brain, which we will get into a bit later with neuroplasticity and neuron connections, and it's easier to acquire a language when you're younger. A bunch of common misconceptions, though, are that being bilingual is easy for kids and impossible for adults, and that once you learn a language, you just know it. And these are untrue for many, many reasons, but the two big reasons that I have found being bilingual is easy for kids is untrue due to the presence of what's called code switching, which, if we go back to my intro, was shown in where I switch from French here to English and then back to French and English. This is called code switching, and it's common among children and often called things like Spanglish, or I know Cajun is a certain dialect that does this, and then impossible for adults. While it can be difficult for adults to learn a second language, it is definitely not impossible. I only started studying French when I was in 7th grade, which is past the point of puberty where it gets a little bit more difficult to learn that language, so it's absolutely not impossible. And once you learn a language, you just know it. This is untrue because neuron connections weaken when they're not used. So if you don't lose the language, you not only lose the ability to recall that information and that vocabulary, but you also lose the connections in your brain. The acquisition of language. So here we get into more of the brain chemistry, the neuroplasticity I was talking about, and something called co-activation. So babies' brains are very neuroplastic because they're learning and they're evolved to be able to absorb these things and to kind of understand it more. And there's a lack of those pre-existing neural pathways that need to be broken to maintain new information. And then language activation is when we hear sequential words, such as when I say the word can, an English brain might think of candle or candy. We try to finish that word because we hear it sequentially. And so bilinguals activate in both languages, hence the co-activation of both languages. So I could start to say a word that starts with S, the syllable S, and somebody in France might think of est-ce que, which in my beginning means do you in French. Or somebody who likes coffee could think of espresso. Somebody who has kind of that self-esteem, more mindset could hear the word esteem. And so that's kind of that co-activation piece that can make it also very difficult for children to learn second languages, but also is integral in the acquisition of a second language. And then neuroplasticity is just in general being easier to encode. So when you think about neuroplasticity, it's the ability to make those new pathways in the brain and to be plastic and changeable. So, as I previously said, it's the ability to change, adapt, and rewire the brain. It's high in children due to a lack of existing pathways. And then we get into Lindenberg's critical period hypothesis. So when you get into the critical period hypothesis, it says that second language acquisition is easy during a biological time frame, and Lindenberg hypothesizes that this is age 2 to puberty, because at around age 12, some of those neuromuscular mechanisms become inactive. We also see something in the brain called the Broca's area, which is integral in language acquisition. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, in addition to serving a role in speech production, the Broca's area also is involved in language comprehension, in motor-related activities associated with hand movements, and in sensory motor learning and integration. So we've all heard about baby ASL, which is sign language. Easy signs such as no, yes, more, please, milk. Just easy hand motions that can really help in the acquisition of language. So the Broca's area really helps with that, as well as learning a second language verbally. So the Broca's area, pardon my hands, is about in this region of the brain, just superior to the Silurian fissure or the lateral sulcus. On this guy, it'd be around here, and you can see in this little thing here, if you can see where I'm pointing, the Broca's area, and there's the Sylvian fissure here, the lateral sulcus. We also get into with Lindenberg's critical period theory, the early and late bilinguals. So what he means by early bilinguals is that somebody who learns a second language from age 2 or even before, because as we'll get into a bit later, language acquisition starts at around 30 weeks gestation and up until age 12. And then late bilinguals are individuals such as myself who learn language after the age of 12. So we already discussed how at age 12 some of those neuromuscular mechanisms become inactive. And then representation and activation. Late bilingual second language is represented in spatially separate brain areas. That's where this Wernicke center comes in here, just at the end of that fissure, whereas the Broca's is in the beginning. And early bilingual second language is activated in closer region of the Broca's area, so it's easier to co-activate, and it's also easier to reinforce those neural pathways between languages. So the benefits of a bilingual brain for late quote-unquote bilinguals is you've been exposed to language as a whole, so you kind of know the more colloquial or the more social aspect of it, which words to use, all of those things, respect mannerisms, even though that does vary by culture and it is quite different. And then the benefits of being an early bilingual is ease of imitation with accents. So we see this in children. They can develop that accent because they're already so predisposed in their brain to imitate. That's one of the many stages of development in children. And then their brain is flexible, as we talked about, that neuroplasticity and a tolerance to change. Children don't have some of the preconceived notions, even neurologically. As I said, the lack of pre-existing neural pathways to kind of break down in order to learn a second language aren't there. And children also don't have the cultural aspect of any sort of prejudices or something like that that would prevent them from even desiring to learn a language. And then we talked about, back to this one, early bilinguals can often encode new language automatically, while later bilinguals usually must use that more effortful processing, and we'll get to that a little bit later too. So for bilingual people, this activation is not limited to a single language. Auditory input activates corresponding words regardless of the language to which they belong. So that kind of goes back to that co-activation that I was talking about earlier, where I begin to say a word that starts with S, and people can think of espresso, esteem, or esque. They're all different, and they activate both the same in those languages in the brain. And then we can also talk about encoding. So according to Spielman in 2017, which is the textbook that we're using for the course, we encode the sounds the words make. This is one of the reasons why much of what we teach young children is done through song, rhyme, and rhythm. So I feel like as kids, we don't recognize that we're learning so much of language through this rhyme and this rhythm. You can even read Shakespeare in his iambic pentameter, and you can see that rhyme, that rhythm that really helps us not only to remember, but to form those pathways in the brain. And as I read earlier, we can encode new language more automatically in the earlier stages of being bilingual and in that earlier conception of language. And then the late bilinguals use that effortful processing, and that starts in the textbook also around that couple of pages is that effortful processing where you really have to put in some cognition in order to recall and make those connections. So bilinguality increases amount of both of gray matter in the left inferior parietal cortex, which is where the Broca's area is actually located, and that comes from Marion and Shook in 2012 of the National Institute of Health article. And they say it appears that bilingual experience not only changes the way neurological structures process information, but also may alter the neurological structures themselves. So this means that not only do we change how we think about things, we also change the physiological structure of our brain when we learn new languages. And then here I just kind of open it up to questions, but because I don't have a live audience, I kind of made up some questions myself. And so we're going to talk about pretty briefly, when do children begin to learn language? So Noam Chomsky says in the womb. As I said, in 30 weeks gestation, babies have been shown to be able to recognize sound and to have those structures, those oral structures in their ears that they can sense. And they start to get this really cool sense of their foreign language versus their home language. So you can understand the differences in accents, as we talked about before, and all that. They can identify that at 30 weeks gestation. And then, according to the McElroy study in 2013, sensory and brain mechanisms for hearing are developed at 30 weeks gestation. And the new study shows that unborn babies are listening to their mothers talk during the last 10 weeks of pregnancy and at birth can demonstrate what they've heard. And my second question here, what is the most important factor in learning language? That's a really, really common one that we hear in late bilinguals. People such as myself, and then people such as my aunt, who is, I believe she's 37, and she's picking up her third language, which is Spanish. So she knows she is already bilingual. She speaks English and French pretty much fluently, and she's trying to pick up Spanish. And this is a common question because a lot of people want to do that, especially in the job market. Nowadays, being bi, tri, or quadrilingual even, is not common in the United States, not surprisingly. And so the most important factors, according to a Farad University study, was motivation and instruction. It's been shown that when you want to do something, you do it very well. And there are so many studies that I can point to say that. But your motivation to learn a language is really the most important key. And then also the instruction you receive. The frequency of the instruction, the intensity, how well you understand these things, more at a teaching, learning perspective, could also help you really acquire that language. So according to, again, Marion and Shook in 2012 from the National Institute of Health, the cognitive, neural, and social advantages observed in bilingual people highlight the need to consider how bilingualism shapes the activity and the architecture of the brain, and ultimately how language is represented in the human mind, especially since the majority of speakers in the world experience life through more than one language. So it's really interesting to see how bilingualism kind of transcends the cognitive, neural, and social advantages. I feel like in this presentation, I didn't speak upon the social aspect too much, but it is really important to note that it is there. It's kind of like the biopsychosocial model of life, and that holistic kind of way of looking at a being is also the same way we look at language. And as I highlighted throughout the presentation, the architecture of the brain. Neurons can actually extend their axons and move the sodium-potassium waves into the synapses in different ways, and they can move all of those things. So the physiology of the brain can change that architecture, and ultimately how language is represented in the human mind. As I said, neuroplasticity, one of the main factors in why it's easily changed in children, is they don't have those pre-existing things to break down. They can only build up. There was a study that says there are 100 billion neurons in a baby's brain, and that is absolutely phenomenal. It's like a galaxy, and they're constantly building these new things and new things and new things, and they can easily comprehend a new language due to the evolution of their constantly learning in that phase. And then this quote goes on to summarize, since the majority of speakers in the world experience life through more than one language. I find it interesting how they use the language of experiencing life through a language. I know in George Orwell's 1984, he begins to talk about newspeak and how that really changes their life in layman's terms. But it changes how they can think, how they can communicate. Language is so much more important than we think it is. I mentioned previously the job market in the United States and that we're struggling with kind of going abroad and making those communications because we're not largely a bilingual country, which is difficult for us. And then I have quite a few references here. Thank you for listening, and this has been wonderful.